Back to Encyclopedia.zone. My name is Dr. Don Jolly. I am a freelance writer whose work has appeared in the Revealer magazine, GFan magazine, among others. I am also the editor-in-chief of Encyclopedia.zone. That's the one URL you need to remember if you want the greatest literary shit posts on the internet by the greatest shit posters of all time. Go to Encyclopedia.zone. Check it out now. We got poetry, we got comics, we got role-playing games, we got animated GIFs, we got unanimated GIFs, we got JPEGs, deep-fried and not deep-fried. We got a picture of O.J. Simpson holding a knife saying, yeah, I'm thinking I did it. He's photoshopped over John Wick. You're going to love it. Go to Encyclopedia.zone right now. Anyway, thanks for joining us today, and thanks for putting up with the inconsistent update schedule. I have been dealing with some pretty terrible shit in my personal life this summer, but I'm trying to get back in the swing of things. This is my, 50th time trying to record this video because, I'm not in the practice of recording videos. So put up with me if I'm maybe a little bit less clear than I usually am. Today, I thought we'd talk about something that's on the tip of all of our tongues right now, we're very interested in, and that's the big convention. Everybody's so interested in this big convention. And of course, I'm talking about the Occult Humanities Conference, which was held at New York University in 2013, which actually has more physical attendees than the Democratic National Convention, which is one of those fucking Comic-Con at-home DC fandom, extended Zoom meetings so that we can get briefed from corporate on how we're all supposed to behave for the next 6 months. And it's fucked up, and it's embarrassing. And the Occult Humanities Conference held at New York University in 2013 was much better. I attended the Occult Humanities Conference because at the time I was writing for the Revealer magazine and I wrote a story about it. So if you Google search Don Jolly Revealer Occult, you will probably find the story, and I think that you will enjoy it. I believe it might actually even be a two-parter, but it was a pretty good story, and I believe it was edited by my very capable editor, Kaylee Handelman, and it turned out pretty well. I was very proud of that story. The Occult Humanities Conference was exactly what it sounds like. It was held at New York University through the School of the Humanities, the College of the Humanities, and it was a set of presentations by both humanities scholars and occultists who happen to be humanities scholars and vice versa. And it was essentially just like a series of lectures about spirit communication, spirit photography, magic with a K and all its different permutations. The occult nature of Allen Ginsberg, I remember, was discussed. And this was in 2013, which was right at the cusp of occultism sort of becoming much more popular and fashionable, at least in New York. I remember that one of the attendees, one of the people that I met at the Occult Humanities Conference, was a woman named Pam Grossman, who had a blog called Phantasmophile, which was sort of at the forefront, the tip of the spear, as it were, of making witchcraft into the very modern, very trendy, very feminist phenomenon that it is today. And it all kind of comes full circle. I've been thinking about this because I heard from a friend of mine in New York last week that he met somebody who had actually received a degree in witchcraft from NYU. In 2013, that was not a program that was offered. I don't know if NYU actually... I don't know if it's actually a program or if this girl, because it is a woman, designed her own degree or what, or she might just be lying. But in any case, we went from, in 2013, we have a conference on the university grounds on the subject of occultism, and now all the way through to offering official licensed training in occultism through the auspices of under the auspices of New York University. So the occult has become much more mainstream, and the weird thing about that is that, when I talk about the occult, it's obviously a very big and diverse field. I should say that my interest in it, I did some work on spiritualism and spirit photography, which I don't think any actual spiritualist would argue that what they're doing is occult. They're just actually a relatively mainline in terms of its behavior, not in terms of its size or influence or anything like that, but they're a relatively benign and conventional American religion with 19th century roots. I would say that it's even like less weird in some ways than Mormonism. So from the outside, you might say that like taking photographs of ghosts and spirit mediumship and that sort of thing, it has an occultic kind of flavor, but for the people that are actually practicing it, I don't think they would be comfortable with being classed in with Aleister Crowley and the spirit communications of John Dee and that kind of thing. I mean, I don't know how they feel about John Dee. But I did my undergraduate thesis on John Dee and Edward Kelly, who John Dee was an English optician, spirit communicator, necromancer, although that I think he would disagree with that appellation and or that categorization, excuse me, and alchemist. And he worked with Edward Kelly on spirit and angel communication experiments throughout the late 1500s, early 1600s. And I did a thesis on it. I was reasonably interested, but I'll be honest. The reason I got into the occult was because I was reading a lot of H.P. Lovecraft, and I liked this idea that there was this secret strand of knowledge that contained the ultimate truth of our existence on Earth. And of course, in Lovecraft, the occult, he's got all of these, occult books, Nameless Cults by von Junst, the Necronomicon of Abdul Alhazred. There's all these, very powerful books of ancient magic that contain, sort of brain-blasting secrets of our existence. And it's not like I had a reasonable expectation that I was going to find an actual Necronomicon, but I did think that if there certainly is this strand of obscure, occulted either by active suppression or just because it's like John Dee, old alchemical texts are very obtuse and very difficult to get into. And there's when you're reading the spirit communications of John Dee and Edward Kelly, these conversations that they had with angels and spirits of various descriptions, apparently, it's very difficult to disentangle what is literally happening, what's metaphorical, what's personal, what's based on their highly specialized and difficult to reconstruct scholarship, because they had access to a lot of books and materials that we do not have access to right now. I mean, for a long time, my pet theory was that Dee and Kelly, who they considered the magic that they were working Enochian, that it was somehow in parallel or a continuance of the interaction that God and his angels had with the prophet, well, not prophet, but with the patriarch Enoch, who's one of the only personages in the Old Testament who is not does not die, but is in fact picked up and carried to heaven. And there's a whole set of extra canonical exegetical literature about Enoch, including his various conversations with angels. So my theory was that John Dee had maybe a Latin copy, maybe a Greek copy of what today we would call the Ethiopian Book of Enoch, which was not technically rediscovered in Europe until several hundred years later. In fact, very close to the early 19th century setting of the book that I want to discuss today and review, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. But my theory about John Dee and the Book of Enoch and the idea that there was some, that he had access to a book that technically he should not have had access to, that he was sort of ahead of the curve, it didn't end up being true. And ultimately my interest in these sorts of materials kind of waned. Because, and this takes us back to the Occult Humanities Conference, it's very interesting to read about magic and angel communication, spirit communication, that sort of thing, when you're doing it by candlelight in a hoary old book, or you're sitting in the dark and sort of ruminating on it in a personal way. It feels ancient. It feels somewhat dangerous. It feels somewhat seditious. And then when you're actually sitting in a college classroom under halogen lights, watching a PowerPoint stack about fucking spirit communication or chiromancy, it loses a little bit of its flavor. The occult, the real occult, I think, gets a lot of its mystique from being obscure. And the thing that started happening a few years ago when I was in New York, as occultism, witchcraft, and all this, these various things that sort of have this whiff of brimstone about them, as they've moved into the cultural mainstream, as they become fashionable, they have definitely lost their mystique and appeal. And they start to just sort of become a mushy morass of new thought, in the religious sense, like new thought as in like your mindset and your intentions shape your world. It becomes a sort of very bland self-help philosophy that essentially has like bizarre progenitor texts. And people can get variously engaged in like the complexities of alchemy or the nature of spirit communication, or the structure of the afterworld. Like, there's all kinds of interesting subjects in occultism that are much less interesting when you view them under the harsh light of orthodoxy. And it's all in the term. For something to be occult, for something to have the interest of the occult, it has to be secret. When the secret becomes common knowledge, when the occult becomes the orthodox, when you can get a degree in witchcraft from New York University, it's no longer the same thing. And, that I think that's why when people write about the occult, like Lovecraft, they have a tendency to sort of invent it out of whole cloth. Lovecraft's, strange occult books do not actually exist. Some of them have been brought into existence since he wrote about them. There's a lot of Necronomicons out there because it's such a popular concept. And the Susanna Clarke in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is a fantasy novel from 2004, does exactly the same thing, because this is a story about magic returning to England in the beginning of the 19th century, and it is also an alternative history of English magic with different periodized times, different luminary magicians that interact with magic and have various theories of magic, and it is invented out of whole cloth. At no point do John Dee or Edward Kelly appear, and I think this is to the book's benefit. So, just to summarize, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is an excellent book. It's also Susanna Clarke's first novel, or at least first published novel. I would imagine that she's got a few in her dresser drawer here. It was first published in 2004, and if you're looking to see if this is a review in terms of like, is it a worthwhile thing to read? Absolutely it is. I think it is a pitch perfect novel and as close to perfection as I've seen in the fantasy genre in the 21st century. So I'm not going to talk about any, I'm going to talk about a couple of plot specifics here, but I think in enough of a offhanded way that if you're the kind of person who really gets hung up on plot, you will be able to still enjoy it after you've seen this review. Like I said, it is a novel about the return of magic to England in the early 19th century, starring the eponymous magicians Jonathan Strange and Gilbert Norrell. And Strange and Norrell are realistic characters in the sense that they resemble actual academics and to an extent actual magicians. They have an intellectual rivalry that is also a debate about the nature of the narrative that they are constructing in returning magic to England. In terms of what goes into Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, like sort of the influences and the reason that exists, its connections to other texts, every review mentions that it is written, sometimes they even say that it's written in a pastiche of Charles Dickens' style, and Dickens is all over it. Susanna Clarke employs Dickens' sort of droll wit. She's got an excellent ear and eye for character, which is also similar to Dickens, although I would not say that Dickens has exclusive ownership of it. I do think that on a sentence-by-sentence level, she is sort of doing a Dickens thing, but it's also a pretty modern book. Like, the sentences themselves tend to be pretty speedy, pretty swift, a little bit more so than you'd see in an actual 19th century novel. I also see some other pieces of influence in there. Obviously, there's the Gothic. I think that there's a little bit of Anne Radcliffe in it, but not a tremendous amount. It's interesting because there is actually the possibility for an Anne Radcliffe, who was a very, very popular pre-Jane Austen writer of Gothic novels, which were novels about primarily young women imperiled in pseudo-magical castles. I actually am a big fan of Anne Radcliffe. There's a possibility for a Radcliffe-style novel within Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. There is definitely a Radcliffe Gothic-style plot line in the character of Lady Pole, who is, in fact, imprisoned and imperiled with within a supernatural castle called Lost Hope. But she's not really the focus of the story. Norrell and Strange are. And Norrell and Strange are very Dickensian kind of characters. And although the debate that they're engaged in is a little bit more metatextual than Dickens gets in everything except Bleak House, I think that that's where people are seeing that influence. I do think that reviews have overstated. I don't think this is a pastiche of Charles Dickens. I think that it is a very, very good book, and that Charles Dickens also wrote very, very good books. And they have some similarities in style and, of course, in setting. But I think it is undercutting Miss Clark to say that she's writing a pastiche of Dickens. Although they do both share the same very winning, droll humor that is throughout the book. Another influence strand that I noticed here is that she makes extensive use of footnotes, which reminded me of one of my favorite early 19th century novels, Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Robert Maturin, which is also, I think, probably the ultimate expression of the overtly supernatural or male Gothic genre. Melmoth the Wanderer is a much more complicated book than Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. It's also much more metatextual. Basically, the way that Clark uses footnotes in the book is to provide background detail, setting detail, and long asides about her alternative history of English magic, which is, in my estimation, much more interesting than the real thing, because unlike the real thing, Clark is able to keep it as secret and as threatening and as bizarre as it needs to be to provoke the proper sense of mystery that one would associate traditionally with the occult. So she uses the footnotes to sort of fill out details of this altar world, whereas Maturin uses his footnotes in a similar way, but he also uses them in this kind of arch way where he's commenting on the story. Sometimes he's providing way too much detail. Sometimes he's providing incredibly basic details. Like the gloss of the footnotes in Melmoth the Wanderer is very fucking interesting. And it does serve to fill out the world of Melmoth, but it also serves to call into question the process of filling out the details of a fantastical world in the first place. I would say that their use in Melmoth is a little bit more sophisticated, which is not to denigrate Clark's usage of footnotes in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I would just say that they both have different concerns. And that in its own way, even though it's set in the early 19th century and it does have these stylistic similarities with Dickens, I think that Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is, not to its detriment, a very modern book. And the idea of building out its alternate setting, creating its universe, as it were, is a very modern set of concerns. And Joanna and Susanna Clarke does an excellent job with it. The other strand of influence or literary connection that we have to talk about when we talk about Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is Harry fucking Potter, because this is a book that exists in the wake of Harry Potter. I have no doubt that this is part of the reason, aside from the book being excellent, that it was published and it was as successful as it was. Because like Harry Potter, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell deals with England, where magic, an England where magic exists and magic has been secreted away, and it's about the revelation of the magical truth underlying sort of the mundane history of England. It's a very similar thing. The difference is that I mean, and I'm not going to talk in any great detail about Harry Potter. I'm familiar with the premise, obviously. I understand parts of it through cultural osmosis. And I think at one point I watched several of the films, but I've tried to make it through that book. Like, they were coming out when I was a kid. I tried to make it through the Philosopher's Stone or whatever the first one is, and it just wasn't working. Not working for me. No disrespect if it did work for you. It's just, personally, I've never been able to get through it. But it was a very big publishing phenomenon, absolute huge success. And so I do see that there's a very direct connection between Harry Potter and the massive success of Harry Potter and sort of thumbing, opening the pathway for Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is very similar in terms of premise. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is not a children's book. It's not exactly a book that's going to be exclusively of interest to adults either. I think it's probably a good book for teenagers to read, but it's a little bit more serious, and of course, because it's set in the 19th century, it's set in a historical England rather than a contemporary one, and it deals with various historical personages. Strange and Norrell obviously are invented characters, but you've got Lord Wellington going around. You get to see some Napoleonic Wars, and Wellington is he's one of the highlights of the book, absolute highlights. He is a perfectly drawn character and absolutely winning on every single page he appears. Perfectly sketched. Lord Byron also appears, and his portrayal was a tad melodramatic to my taste, but at the same time, it's Lord fucking Byron, so how are you supposed to portray him without melodrama? I don't think it's possible. But I didn't like his appearances in the book quite as much as Wellington. He felt more like a cartoon. But, at the same time, he sort of consciously cultivated that atmosphere, so I don't know what Clark is supposed to do with it. The historical characters that show up in the book are very, very interesting, very well drawn, and there's a lot of verisimilitude in its portrayal of early 19th century England. The gloss, the addition of magic, fits very snugly into this history of England. Like a lot of fantasy books, the theme of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is the return of magic to England. It's sort of an inverse Tolkien. Tolkien deals with the departure of magic, the end of the era of fairy stories, and the beginning of what we would consider history. Susanna Clarke takes, the inverse of that. It's kind of George R. R. Martin is doing a similar thing with Game of Thrones. I've also been reading the second Game of Thrones book. I suppose I'll do a video about that before too long. But the return of magic to England is actually very interesting in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, because from the beginning they say that there is no more magic practiced in England. And as the book progresses, you realize that this is not actually true, that magic has always existed and currently exists in England. It is simply that it has fallen out of favor. It has become unfashionable, it has become ungentlemanly, and its performance has sort of slipped into the lower classes. It has become something that is not countenanced in polite society. And this is one of the big themes of the book, which is the limits of polite society and the locus, the very narrow aperture through which a society perceives itself, that there's all these things outside of its mainstream that are separated from it by usually class, that are not considered an essential part of the national character, but absolutely, definitively are. They're just ignored by the very thin band of acceptable information that is sort of suffered within polite society, middle class society, and by the ruling class. One of the most interesting characters in the book is Stephen Black, who is he's the son of a Jamaican slave who's working as a servant in England. And I know that, when I bring that up, people's hackles are going to start rising, because then you start thinking, is this just some token SJW, kind of character? But no, Stephen Black, because obviously, if this were actually a book written in the early 19th century, we would not have a point of view character that's a black servant. At least, it wouldn't be common to find a character like that. But Susanna Clarke does, once again, this is not a direct pastiche of a 19th century novel. It's very modern. And Stephen Black is a very well-drawn character who does not succumb to tokenism. He's not hyper, aware, hyper affected. He's not like the black guy in the Mod Squad who's like a brain surgeon race car driver and everybody's just in awe of him, which is like, almost a condescending way to incorporate a traditionally ignored minority voice into your story that you see all the time in present pop culture. Stephen Black is not that character. Stephen Black and the character of Lady Pole, who's the imperiled young woman in the magical castle that I talked about earlier, they actually play into the theme of the book very directly, in that they are both sort of ensorcelled by this fairy who's called the Man with the Thistledown Hair. And I don't mean fairy as in like, Winx Club, bug wings kind of thing. I mean like old school fairy tale, very threatening, very alien fairy, which is kind of a common theme through the whole book. Susanna Clarke's idea of magic is very tied to this sort of fairy tale, folk magic, superstition, English superstition worldview. And so it's very alien. It originates in a place that is sort of at odd angles to the earth. It's very threatening, and it is governed by obtuse rules that are not readily apparent, either to the reader or the magicians who are attempting to figure them out. Stephen Black and Lady Pole are both characters who are on the periphery of the acceptable band of thought within 19th century English society. Strange and Norrell have the ability to return magic to England because they are both gentlemen. They come from landed gentry. They have access to resources. They are able to make themselves presentable to polite society and to the court. And this is what constitutes magic's return. Magic has actually been there the whole time in Clarke's worldview. It's just that it needed to be presented before England in clothes that made it acceptable. It needed to come in a gentleman's guise. Both Stephen Black and Lady Pole are ensorcelled, but are, due to the specifics of their enchantment, cannot speak about it. When they try to speak about it, they start to ramble in completely incoherent folk tales and fairy stories. And so they're having this in some ways they're having the most direct and potent and threatening experience of fairy magic of any character in the book. But they can't talk about it to anybody because it's, the early 19th century, and ain't nobody in fucking polite society give a shit what a woman or a black servant have to say. So it's not that this point is not driven home with a fucking maul. It's not, hit you over the head with it. But a big theme of the book is how thin and how narrow the locus of acceptable discourse is, and how these people whose points of view fall outside the locus of acceptable discourse are effectively silenced and ignored. There's also a character named Vinculus, who is dismissed as a completely ineffective, hedge magician, charlatan, essentially, initially, because he's poor, who has a similar deep and profound connection with the truth of English magic that nobody will pay attention to, at least in the early parts of the book, because he's a ragged man who lives in a tent. So, the Clarke does a very good job of connecting all these characters up with their themes. The characters are all incredibly distinct, and it's just it is a perfectly cut it is a perfectly cut diamond of a novel in that way. Let's see, what else do I have to talk about here? Yeah, that's just about it. I mean, it's a strong recommend, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I do want to talk just for a second. There's a BBC adaptation of the novel that is respectable in a number of different ways. I think that the cats they got playing Strange and Norrell are excellent. It does a good job of catching some of the mood of the book, but it's a very long book with a lot of incidents that crosses the whole continent of Europe and in fact has a brief foray into America, which is one of the best parts of the book, even though it's only a couple of pages. But in adapting it to the screen, it's one of those adaptations where it's basically like a greatest hits collection of scenes from the story. The alterations that they make for the purposes of time become more noticeable as you get on towards the conclusion. And I would just say, honestly, that it's not... When you watch the series, if you come at it without having read the book, I don't know if it would actually thread together for you. I don't know if it actually makes sense, because so much of the explanatory material has been cut. It just kind of plays like, okay, we got to do this scene, then we got to do this scene, then we got to do this scene, until it gets to the end, and then it starts to diverge. I would recommend reading the book over watching the series, obviously. I would also recommend watching the series after you've read the book. If you haven't read the book and you don't have time for it, maybe check out the series, see if the tone and the atmosphere get at you, because I do think they do a very good job of capturing that. And otherwise, I don't know. It's just it's sort of a lightweight production. I think the book is much better. So the log line here, and it's always very difficult to review a good book, but the log line here is that this is a perfectly constructed novel with very interesting characters that doesn't talk down to its audience. If you like fucking magic bullshit, if you like the mystique of the occult, and you aren't going to be upset by the fact that this is a completely fictionalized version of English magic, I think you will find a good friend and stolid companion in this book. And Susanna Clarke has a new book called Piranesi. It's coming out in September, so that's next month, and I think it would be a pretty excellent time to get invested in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell if you haven't already, because she's got this new book coming out, and based on how good this one is, I expect great things. Thank you very much for watching the review, and we'll have more coming very soon.